Tonight's lecture is about global warming, and it is a hot topic. As I reflected over the last week, what? Did I say something wrong?
No, it was right. An unintentional pun is the right kind.
Okay. As I reflected the last week on this topic, thinking about my introduction, I realized how ubiquitous it is in our lives. So just for instance, over the last week, I noticed when I went to Starbucks, there's on the recycled cup, there's a quote about the environment, and you can, right before you purchase, or right before you go, you can purchase Arctic Tale, which is a DVD about how the polar ice cap is going to be gone in about 30 years. I went to my parents' house, good Dutch house, and there was the banner. This latest issue has a couple full-color pages of environmentally friendly ideas. My husband and I went to the Grand Rapids Art Museum. It's a LEED museum, and did you know that Metro Grand Rapids has more LEED-certified square feet per capita than any other city in America? All right, I went to book airline tickets, and before I cashed out, you can check a little box which offsets your carbon footprint for the flight. I don't know, maybe some of you got this too, but last week I got a phone call asking me, a market research phone call, and they were wondering if I would be, if I'm interested in light rail here in Grand Rapids. They're thinking about putting in light rail because it helps save the environment. And the last one just came in last night. We were looking at the mail, and the University of Michigan's newsletter, alumni newsletter, is called The Greening of Everything, which seems very appropriate. So if you're like me, you see this everywhere, and you want to help the environment. But you think, there are so many facts and figures, so many instructions, it almost leaves you with more questions. And the problem, of course, with these questions is that they're complex, and they come in some diverse categories. For instance, the first set of questions are the scientific ones. Is it warming? And if so, why? Why have scientists found it so controversial? And what's going to happen in the future? What will we leave our grandkids? The second set of questions are sort of the economic and practical questions. Those are, what can and should be done? What should the government do? And are there any solutions that we can propose that don't harm or further impoverish the most vulnerable and poor people on the planet? And then there's this third group of questions that's really important to most of us. Those are the theological questions. As a child of God and a steward of our planet, what does God call me to do about it? And the most important theological question, my personal favorite, what would Jesus drive? So, the problem is, of course, that there aren't a ton of people who can answer everything about this topic, this very thorny topic. But tonight's speaker is one of them. Can you see me better now? Dr. Jay Richards is research fellow and director of media here at the Acton Institute. He has a PhD in philosophy and theology from Princeton Theological Seminary, a master's in theology from Calvin Theological Seminary, master's in divinity from Union Theological Seminary. I think that's enough now. Mm-hmm. His latest post, he was a research fellow at the Discovery Institute, which is a more scientific and technology-oriented institute in Seattle. And there he wrote a book and a documentary called The Privileged Planet with astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez. He's just recently finished his most recent book, The Christian Case for Capitalism, which is due out from HarperCollins a year from now. And finally, sort of to top it all off, using his creative side, he also executive produces our documentaries and film. He will take question and answers for those of you who also have questions. And without further ado, I introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jay Richards.
Thanks, it's great. Thank you, Rachel, that was great. And it's actually a perfect setup. We didn't coordinate this, but what I really want to do tonight is a little bit of everything. So sort of a mile wide and an inch deep, but a little bit of theology, a little bit of science, and a little bit of economics. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the Acton Institute is an educational and research think tank headquartered here in Grand Rapids, and we deal with the synthesis of theology and economics, in particular the Judeo-Christian theological tradition on the one hand and free market economics on the other. Our sort of motto is connecting good intentions with sound economics. So we're interested in economic questions, but we don't privilege those over theological questions. And frankly, this is one of the reasons I got interested in the issue of global warming, and it's why Acton has always taken an interest in environmental stewardship issues from its founding almost 19 years ago now. By the way, Rich, I don't know if you know there's an answer to the question of what would Jesus drive. And in the New Testament he says, I do not speak of my own accord. All right? I've got an accord. Yeah, so that has an answer. But it doesn't solve the global warming problem, unfortunately. So, whatever your view coming into this tonight, I hope you get something out of what we're going to talk about. As Rachel said, I did a book published in 2004 called The Privileged Planet with an astronomer. Guillermo is a research astronomer that specializes in stellar spectroscopy. I can barely say the word. I mean, he's a scientific specialist, and I'm very much a shameless generalist. I feel for my calling to try to translate complicated scientific and economic ideas for general audiences, to try to describe these ideas in general terms that don't require specialized background knowledge. And that's really hard when it comes to an issue like global warming. As Rachel said, there's just a vast array of technical detail that you'd have at your disposal and really have to master to be able to ultimately answer all the questions that could be asked about global warming. And so I'm not going to do that tonight. In fact, there's no one walking the planet that has a mastery of all the relevant details. But what I do think all of us can do, all thinking human beings and all concerned human beings that are asking difficult moral and theological and economic questions, is try to think clearly about the issue. And that's frankly what I hope you'll get out of this tonight. If it's nothing else, I'm going to share my own opinions on this in the next few minutes. But more than convincing you of my particular take on this issue, I hope that I will have at least encouraged you to think more clearly about this issue as you deal with it yourself. Of course, it's not a coincidence we decided to do this at Acton in April. Of course, this is near Earth Week, and I notice every year I'm always going someplace in an airport right near Earth Day and Earth Week and sort of Earth Month, as April has come to be. And every other magazine has its annual green issue. Vanity Fair this year has its third green issue. Time magazine, if you just wander into a newsstand, virtually every news and news magazine and People magazine, the vast array of magazines that you see at your disposal, all seem to have some take on environmental issues, and in particular on global warming. I've talked about a lot of complicated and actually controversial issues in the last few years, and this is an issue that I think in some ways upsets people more than any other topic. I've discussed questions like the existence of God, questions about whether there's evidence for design in the universe, really controversial things, and this is the only topic I've ever spoken on in which someone usually leaves before the end of the discussion, leaves the hall. So I hope that doesn't happen tonight, but I do think it at least signals the fact that there are fundamental issues at stake in this question. We're not just dealing with some boring scientific question like we're asking some question about the nature of energy or the quantum mechanics or something like that. We're dealing with an issue in which theological and moral and metaphysical and scientific issues collide and intersect. And we're dealing ultimately with the question about what we should do, how we should order ourselves as a society, how we should consume and use energy, how we should treat our fellow human beings. And so I think there's a reason that we ask and consider all these questions. So I'm going to try to use a new technology tonight as we walk through this. Well, I want to begin with just a theological question. I actually tried to change the title of the slides here. Wasn't able to do that, but when you're trying to frame this theologically, I mean, really the first question is, why should we care? I mean, it's possible if you're a Christian or a part of the Christian tradition, you might say, well, aren't environmental issues, isn't this sort of distracting us from the Great Commission? Why are we even asking this question? Why are we worrying about how many trees we're cutting down or how much CO2 we're emitting in the atmosphere? Shouldn't we be about the Great Commission, about evangelism or something like that? And there was a famous statement attributed to Dwight Moody, an earlier part of about a century ago. He said, why polish the brass on a sinking ship? That might be a response that a Christian would have. Well, look, considering all the issues we have to be concerned about, why bother with this? I mean, isn't Jesus going to return and transform the heavens and the earth and maybe burn it up as dross anyway? So why should we be concerned about the earth? Well, I think the short answer to that is because God is. God in the Christian tradition became man in Jesus Christ. He became incarnate as a human being, and showed many things, but in particular, his concern for human beings whom he had created in his image. But he also became a part of the material world. This is God's world. He didn't just create human beings. If you read the book of Job in the Old Testament, God ultimately indicts Job at the end of Job for asking him all of these questions as to whether he's just. And God says to Job, were you there when I created the Pleiades and Orion? Were you there when I created Behemoth with a tail like cedar? Were you there when I created the great Leviathan, these animals? The point is, God is saying, I have many purposes that you know nothing about. This is my world. I created you, man and woman, in my image. You're, in a sense, the crowning achievement of creation, but you're not my only purpose. This is God's world, and we, as its stewards, are held responsible for how we treat it. I think that's a sort of basic, non-negotiable Christian answer to the question of why we should care. There's a great Dutch statesman and theologian named Abraham Kuyper who once said famously, there is not 1 square inch of creation over which Christ does not declare mine. In other words, there's no question we can ask about our lives, about economics, about how we should order our families, about how we should order society, about how we would act as business people or act as parents, that there is not some relevance to the Christian faith in how we order those things. And so it is with the environment. It's grounded at the very beginning of the text of Scripture in the book of Genesis. And I have just a couple of examples here. I call this a sort of theological non-negotiable, and that's why I start with it. This is the sort of thing, I don't think there is really a Christian answer. For instance, what would Jesus drive? I think the more precise question would be, what would Jesus have me do with my transportation choices, given all the things I have to do? I drive myself to work most of the time, by myself. So it makes sense that I drive a Honda Accord, as it turns out, a smaller car. If I had several kids that I had to take to school and here and there to soccer and various schools, it would make sense that I'd have a larger minivan, right? So there's not one unique answer, one unique Christian answer to a lot of these questions. But I do think there's one sort of theological non-negotiable, and it's that we are created as stewards of the environment. And it's grounded right here, as I said, in the first chapter of Genesis. Now, most of us probably in the room at least know the basic story in Genesis 1. It describes God as creating the universe in a work week. We have a work week, 6 24-hour days. The earth rotates on its axis toward and away from the sun. That circumscribes our days and our week. God, in some mysterious sense, also has a work week, though he creates it himself. The first day, he says, let there be light, separates the light from the darkness, and then that sets the first evening and morning, his first day. And then it describes this series of acts in which God creates everything that is. The heavens and the earth is the biblical idiom for everything other than God. But what happens on the sixth day? God creates the land animals, and suddenly there's an encore. There's not an encore on the first 5 days, but in the sixth day, the text actually changes from prose to verse. And God, instead of saying, let there be, suddenly sort of speaks to himself, to the heavenly council. It's as if he's speaking, at least in sort of Old Testament sense, to the Holy Trinity, to himself in his divine plurality. He says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. It's the only thing in all of creation it's spoken of this way. God creating something, not simply from nothing, but creating a being in some sense in his image. And then the first thing he does is bless them with a commandment. And this is the blessing. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, when some people see this, they see dominion, they think, okay, does that mean domination or destruction? It doesn't mean that. There's a famous essay written in 1967 in Science magazine by a guy named Lynn White, who blamed the ecological crisis of modern society on the Judeo-Christian tradition in general, and on this passage in particular. So this idea of dominion, of humans' dominion over creation, has led us to rape and pillage the earth. If you look at the text carefully, the dominion being referred to here is the dominion of benevolent kings and queens. Remember, the ultimate Lord, the ultimate king in the Bible is God. And God is perfect goodness and love. In the same way, when he commands those beings in his image to have dominion, he is referring to the dominion of benevolent vice-regents, or stewards, who represent God before the rest of creation, but are also ultimately held accountable for how they treat that creation. That's the idea of being a steward over creation. It's right there at the beginning of the text. So it's not as if environmental questions are somehow peripheral to the Christian tradition. That's the good part of the story, the sort of grounding, I think, of an environmental ethic. The reason it matters is because ultimately the world is not the way it's supposed to be. The fall happened. The world we see, the life we experience, is not Eden and it's not the kingdom of God. It's somewhere in the middle. It continues to be a good creation, a good world, which is nevertheless fractured and fallen. And Paul says it's not just human sin and human society that's affected by the fall, but all of the created order itself. Let me just click here to the next passage right here. In the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. Here's how he puts it. It says, the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. The entire creation is in some sense slowly groaning up to the present time and will continue to do so until the consummation of the kingdom. So we are placed in a good world as stewards who will be held responsible for how we treat the earth. And the earth, all of creation, is somehow affected by the fall. That means we can mess things up. And sometimes we do mess things up. So I think that is the sort of fundamental, non-negotiable theological issues. Now here's the problem. What I'm describing, I would say, are theological principles. They're basic background principles that not only Christians, but anyone that sort of feels loyal to the Judeo-Christian tradition ought to take for granted. That we're stewards and that we can mess things up. But that doesn't answer difficult questions like, should I separate papers and plastics? Is it more efficient to separate papers, plastics, newspapers, different kinds of plastics, glasses, I forget, lots of other sort of categories in Seattle that we had to separate when I lived there? Or should all that stuff just be dumped in one big truck and then separated on site at the dump? That's an economic question that ought to be analyzed. We shouldn't just assume that separating papers and plastics at home is the only way to translate an environmental ethic. This is the difference between a theological principle on the one hand and a prudential judgment on the other. And to apply a theological principle to a prudential judgment, like should I separate papers or plastics, we have to think clearly. We have to think through the consequences of our actions. We have to think about the economic implications and all sorts of scientific issues. We have to calculate, the different trucks that come to pick up the different types of products that we recycle at our doorstep, as opposed to just one truck dumping it. All that kind of stuff would have to be considered before we could apply the principle to the prudential judgment. And that finally is the problem when we think as Christians about global warming. There's not a simple answer, because the theological principle is that we should be concerned about any environmental issue, especially one in which we could potentially be having adverse effect on the environment. But we still have a lot of difficult scientific and economic questions to answer before we can actually apply that principle practically. So that's the theological background, and that's all I'll say about that. Please feel free to ask any question you want later. But I take that stuff as sort of non-controversial. I don't think I've said anything that anyone broadly in the Christian tradition would find objectionable. Many of the things I'll probably say in the next 20 minutes, though, we'll have some disagreement about. So let me just start by analyzing the basic issue. The question I wanted to ask and didn't have on the opening slide is, what should Christians think about global warming? The first question is, what exactly is global warming? If you Google my name, unfortunately, because I've talked on this issue for a couple of years, I get called a global warming skeptic. And yet, if you're simply asking me the question about whether I think the globe is warming, I would say yes. And so what does it mean to be a global warming skeptic? Well, you got to first define the term. And so here's how I'm going to define the basic controversy over global warming. I think the basic claim of global warming can be boiled down to three basic claims. It's this. The first is that we are presently experiencing a specific type of climate change, in particular climate change in which the average global temperature is going up over time. If you notice in the last couple of years, the language has actually changed, so there's more talk about climate change and less about global warming. And we can talk about why that is later. But in any case, whether we're going down or up, if the global temperature is changing, then we're experiencing climate change, right? That's not really that interesting. I mean, the climate's always changing, right? I mean, until we get to absolute zero or something like that, something's always going to be happening. what's interesting about it, and the reason we have so much debate in political and economic terms, is because of this additional claim that it's human-induced. That human beings are primarily, or perhaps even exclusively, responsible for the current warming trend. All right? So climate change, that's human-induced. But that by itself isn't quite enough either, because what if it's just so negligible as to make no appreciable difference? Well, we wouldn't be talking about it, would we? But that additional third claim is what really matters. This climate change is human-induced and likely to be catastrophic. And so it's catastrophic, human-induced climate change that we're talking about when we're talking about global warming. You can see why the word global warming caught on, right? It's really hard to say catastrophic, human-induced climate change. That's the basic idea. And you see it every year in April on the covers of magazines. And I've noticed this now for 3 years running, that we get a picture. Is there a laser pointer on this, Dave? Better not risk it. But every year about this time, you get a picture of a poor polar bear on a piece of ice looking out into the water. And I found out a couple of months ago, this is 2006, Time magazine, be worried, be very worried. All right, it's not just, well, it looks like the climate's changing. All right, it's catastrophic. It's something we need to do something about. Now notice, I just want to pause for a minute. This is a rabbit trail, but I want you to notice something about the way in which ideas are communicated. Now, notice the polar bear on the ice here. What if you just saw that picture? What would you know? Now, if I saw that picture by itself, I'd think he's waiting for a seal to come up for air, right, so he can bite its head off. But you get the interpretation provided for you in the text. The assumption is that you're seeing a polar bear at the edge of a sort of ice sheet that's melting. The land is far off someplace, and he's in danger of drowning. Well, several of these pictures, actually, if you check their provenance, that's not actually what's going on. And there's actually copyright infringement with one of the most popular images some of you may have seen of some polar bears on an iceberg. It turns out we're very close to land, and we're just frolicking on this piece of ice, and we're not in danger of drowning. But I just want to draw your attention to that, the power of images and words that do the interpreting for us. That's what we have here. But you get this every year, and we have it again in 2007 and 2008. Catastrophic, human-induced climate change. If one of those things isn't there, then it ends up not being that interesting of an issue. All right? So that's the basic claim. There's also a basic argument. And like I said, there's a vast array of scientific data and evidence that would go into actually establishing the case for catastrophic human-induced climate change. But the basic argument is really, really simple. Here it is. For decades, scientists have postulated that increases in carbon dioxide, CO2, and other gases could lead to a greenhouse effect. A greenhouse effect is just what it sounds like, an effect in the atmosphere in which heat is trapped, leading to a warming effect. Now, we exist because of a greenhouse effect. Without the atmosphere, the surface of the Earth would be too cold for large animal life like ourselves to exist. So the greenhouse effect is responsible for a great deal of the life on the surface of the planet. But of course, you can get too much of a good thing. The surface of Venus, a sort of sister planet in the solar system, is something like 800 degrees Fahrenheit on its surface, probably because of a little bit too much of a greenhouse effect. All right? So that's the basic idea. Not hugely controversial. Second claim is this. The temperature has risen during the 20th century while greenhouse gases, that is CO2 and methane and a few other identified greenhouse gases, have proliferated due to human activities. So we have added greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide and methane and things like that at the same time that we've seen a temperature rise during the 20th century. So we've got these two things happening at once. All right? Therefore, greenhouse gases must be the cause. There's a kind of a better way to put it. You could just say, therefore, greenhouse gases probably are the cause. That's the basic argument. It seems pretty straightforward and persuasive if that's all you have. Right? All right, so we've got a basic claim, we've got a basic argument, and we've got what I would say are the four basic questions, or the four big questions you've got to ask about this issue. As Rachel may have mentioned, my background is philosophy and analytic philosophy, and so reduced to essentials, I end up sort of boiling down the basic arguments on almost any subject, and that's what I'm trying to do here. Here are the four big questions, and I think these are actually in your handout. First is just this question: is the Earth warming? It's an empirical question. Is it, in fact, getting warmer? Second, are we causing it? Remember the human-induced part. Now, that's a separate question. Almost every time I talk about this issue on a radio program, someone calls in, and I'm dealing with the second question, are we causing it? And they say, what about the evidence that the Arctic ice shelf is melting? Well, they're talking about one, right? But even if ice is melting on the poles, that doesn't answer question 2. What's causing it? Third question, is it bad? All right, I can't really see you, unfortunately, but be honest. For those of you that haven't followed this issue, how many of you have even thought to ask that question before? Is it bad? Some of you. Right? And it seems obvious, right, once you point it out. It's going to be bad or good or neutral, right? But think about the coverage. How much news coverage have you ever seen on this topic that explores the question of whether it's bad or good? Not very much, because there hasn't ever been very much. Fourth question, would the advised policies make any difference in any case? That's the ultimate prudential question. And if we want to apply a theological principle, like the fact that we should be good stewards, to a question like global warming, we're way out at question 4. Would this particular policy or that particular policy make any difference in any case? And so you've got to do a lot of thinking before you get from the principle to the judgment. All right. Now, let me just give you what I think the sort of current status of the evidence is. And I openly and fully admit that I could be completely wrong on this. This is my own, I think, moderately educated judgment on the question. But it's literally impossible to stay in command of the scientific literature on this subject. Even in geophysics or something like that, there's no one that can keep up. So the best you can do is try to assess the general evidence. Is the Earth warming? Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I don't think it's all that controversial. It looks pretty certain that we're in a slight warming trend that started around 1850 or maybe 1870, with the decline from about 1940 to the mid-1970s, and has continued to increase after that. It's about a 1.5 degree Fahrenheit increase since about 1850. So that's a warming trend. But notice that there's a really important question here. When somebody says, is the Earth warming, you have to ask, since when? What's the baseline? Right? That's a really important question, because notice we're starting about 1850 here. If I had said, is it warming since the year 1000, the answer would probably be no. But if you judge from about 1850 or so, it looks like we're in a warming trend. And this comes from lots of different kinds of evidence, but primarily ground-based temperature measuring stations and much more recently satellite measuring stations and all sorts of proxies from ice cores and lake bed cores and things like that. But notice this sort of particular diagram here starting in 1850. You've got 2 different sets of mixed data showing more or less the same thing. But notice where it cuts off, 1850. Now, if any of you had a course in astronomy or in geology, you'll know that the Earth, over large geological periods of time, undergoes vast climate changes. Ice ages, for instance, 10,000 years ago, was much colder and more hostile than it is now. Sea levels have been rising sporadically since the last ice age. We're in the so-called interglacial period between ice ages, between periods in which glaciers cover large surfaces of the Earth. And so a lot of it depends on both the baseline and the time scales that you're dealing with as to how you ask this question. 2 million to 10,000 years ago is the last major ice age. 200 BC to AD 600, it's called the Roman warming period. 600 to 900 AD, the so-called Dark Ages cold period. Now, that's different from the historical myth that there was a Dark Ages, but there was a cold period. Cold snap, certainly in Northern Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire. Then about 900 to 1300 AD, the so-called medieval warming, or late climate optimum, that we'll talk about in a minute. And then a little ice age in the mid part of the last millennium. And as I said, from 1850 to about 1940, a warming. From 1940 to the 70s, a cooling. And from the 70s until about 1998 at least, a warming again. Now, I do that. That I know is tedious, but I do it for a purpose. Because I want you to see that warming and cooling trends on not only large geological timescales, but recent recorded history to climate has varied dramatically. All right. By the way, from 1979 to the present, there's a large disparity between surface temperature measurements, which show a fairly strong warming, and the independent temperature reading in satellite and balloon measurements, which show less of a warming trend. But I still think the evidence is in favor of the claim that we're in a warming trend from about 1850. And I don't think 1850 is arbitrary. That's about the period in which major industrial revolution really started to make a difference on the environment. All right? So if someone says, am I a global warming skeptic? I say, if the claim is the globe warming, I say, no, I think the evidence is pretty good that it is. All right? But remember, that's just one question, right? Now, this is, sometimes I say, I'll tell you when I get to the controversial part. I'm getting to the controversial part, all right? Here we are. All right? This is where almost all the action is, where almost all the arguments take place. And it's this: are we causing it? Now, why is that controversial? Well, it should be clear, if we're not causing it, or if nothing we do makes any difference, then there's no policy answer to the question. Right? There's no policy answer to our orbit around the center of the Milky Way galaxy and how far we are from the nearest spiral arm. Right? We have no effect as to where our solar system is in the galaxy. I'm pretty sure Washington, D.C. can't affect that, at least not yet. Right? So we don't ask the question. But if we're causing it, there is a moral issue and perhaps a political or policy issue. So there's a reason it would be controversial. Now, this is uncontroversial. The concentrations in CO2 in the atmosphere have gone up. The graph I have here, I can hardly see it. I think it's from 1955. But if you notice, it starts about 315 parts per million carbon dioxide. Right? So 315 parts to a million parts. So less than 1/100th of 1% of the atmosphere, to about almost 380 parts per million currently. All right, so we're talking about very small trace amounts, but it's definitely going up. And I think there's little question that humans are definitely doing a great deal of the contributing. It's not, of course, nature has a great deal of CO2, and the atmosphere already has plenty of CO2 in it from natural causes, but it seems to be clear that it's our activities that are raising the amount. So that's not controversial. The question is whether our contributions are causing the current warming. And this is the place where if I could ask you to think hard in one place, it's right here. All right? Now here's what you have to think about to answer the question of whether we're causing it. First one you will have learned if you ever had a statistics class. Correlation isn't causation. Remember the argument? Basic theory about greenhouse gases. Global temperatures and greenhouse gases, or CO2, are going up at the same time in the 20th century. That's a correlation. All right? But the fact that those two things are happening at the same time, a correlation, doesn't tell you that one is causing the other. And even if one is causing the other, it doesn't tell you which one's the cause and which one's the effect. That's the dilemma. Right? Now, we do have some theoretical reasons for thinking we have an answer to it, but it's important to remember that. This is, I think, the more interesting one. The basic global warming theory, the basic theory that is assumed in the major models that say the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the UN assumes, right, is a difficult time explaining past climate change. Remember, there's a correlation between temperature increase and CO2 right now. But we weren't adding CO2 into the atmosphere 1,000 years ago. And yet we know there was a medieval warming period. In fact, it was almost certainly warmer 1,000 years ago than it is today. Why did that happen? That's the reason, by the way, that Greenland is called Greenland. The time, less than 1,000 years ago, in which the Vikings settled Greenland because it was a pleasant place to live. Other people heard about it. It was settled by many tens of thousands of people, and then sometime between I think 1500 and 1750, they had to leave it because it got too cold again. What caused that? What's caused past climate changes? Now, there is a correlation between CO2 and temperature in data records. How many of you have seen the film An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore? There's a dramatic scene, the most dramatic scene in the film is this. He shows a graph, and I don't have it here, I should probably add it, shows a graph of the past climate. And you see a graph going up and down, all right? And then he superimposes measurements over the same period of time of CO2 in the atmosphere. There's a very tight correlation. Now, it's supposed to be the sort of aha moment in the film, because the point is that he says that tight correlation shows that the CO2 going up in the atmosphere leads to the temperature increase. Well, Gore made an unforgivable scientific error here, so bad that even the Science Times and the New York Times had to correct him on this point. Because you actually look at the data, turns out that in most cases, yeah, there's a correlation. But in most cases, the temperature goes up first, and then the CO2 goes up in the records a few hundred years later. Now let that sink in. Right? The CO2 goes up after the temperature goes up in most cases in the data. Now, unless we've got backwards causation, right, in the climate, something fishy's going on. And we actually know why this is. The oceans, when they're cooler, can hold more CO2. And when they're warmer, they release more CO2 into the atmosphere. And so if the climate warms for whatever reason, because of some variations in circulations of the atmosphere, because of variations in the output of the energy of the sun, whatever, if the temperature goes up, over time, the oceans are going to release more CO2 into the atmosphere. If temperature goes down over time, the oceans will hold more. So there's a reason why that would happen. And so that correlation, see, in that case, if anything, is reversed. And so it doesn't give us any especially satisfying explanation for past climate change. The other thing is that we know of other possible causes. The greenhouse gas theory is one possible cause for climate change. This is, by the way, just the technical graph showing. I don't like this picture as much, so I don't linger long on it. But it's the same basic idea. You see the cooling here in the dark, so-called dark age cooling period, and the medieval warming period, the little ice age, and the current warming. See the spikes? You've got it slightly warmer in the Middle Ages. Right? Another possible cause is solar activity. Now, this is a hugely controversial subject, but there's a scientist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics named Willie Soon who's done a series of groundbreaking papers showing an interesting correlation between certain types of solar activity and past climate change. All right, now, I mean, just kind of at an intuitive level, do you think that maybe the yellow dwarf star 93 million miles away might have something to do with the climate change, that we're undergoing? It seems at least intuitively plausible that the sun ought to be calculated in any of these debates. And Soon and many others at least think that variations either in sunspot cycles or energy output of the sun may actually be the primary cause of the climate change we're currently experiencing. Some others actually think that we're actually at the end of a cycle and will probably be in for some cooling. So they're making a prediction that we're getting ready to begin a cooling cycle. There's another discovery made in 1996 by some European scientists. The first is a Danish scientist named Donsgaard. And they won the Tyler Prize, which is sort of the environmental Nobel Prize in 1996 for the discovery of a so-called 1,500-year solar cycle that they detect for thousands of years back in climate records, which they think explains most of the warming that we're seeing now, that we're actually part of this 1,500-year climate cycle that, in addition to other climate cycles, is probably responsible for this. But you hear almost nothing about this. They won the Tyler Prize, which is as good as it gets in environmental science, but you hear very little about this possibility. All right, so I don't want to get bogged down in the details tonight, but I want you to sort of see what I'm saying. The question of whether we're causing it, you can't establish it from the correlation of temperature increase in CO2. We know that that is not going to explain past climate changes that we know about, right? And we know of other possible causes for the temperature increase. Right? Now, this doesn't establish anything at this point, I don't think, but I want you to see that the field is ripe for picking. And there's a lot of different produce growing at the moment. It's not a simple answer. And if somebody says there is a consensus on this question, they are lying. There simply is not a consensus on this question. It's a field that's widely debated. Now, most scientists assume that humans are contributing in some way to the climate. I would be surprised if we literally could do nothing to affect the climate. The question is whether we're doing anything appreciable or whether we're the primary cause of the global warming that we're experiencing. All right? Now, we could sort of bore ourselves to tears on the details here, but I just want you to get the basic outlines right now. All right? All right, the third question, and this is actually my favorite. Is it bad? This is the thing that you can get tomatoes thrown at you, actually. I talked about this subject at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the fall. It's different from Grand Rapids at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And they're the banana slugs, is there. Not the Trojans, not the Wolverines, the banana slugs, okay? And this one, I mean, I had a professor, he basically told me I needed to go to prison where I could not speak my opinions because I dared to ask this question. I was surprised. But he said, I was putting the planet at risk by asking this question because the answer was self-evident. Of course it was bad. All right. Well, I said, well, I'm from Michigan, and it's not quite as obvious that warming is bad. All right, but here's the basic issue, and I don't want to make it a trivial point. But it's not self-evident that a moderate warming trend is, on balance, a bad thing. Any kind of change is going to there are going to be some kind of trade-offs. There's going to be costs for some people, probably, and there are going to be benefits for others. The other thing is that we don't know what the optimum global average temperature is. To know whether it's bad, we'd have to know what is the optimum, and are we moving toward it or away from it? No one has an answer to that question. Now, we, of course, know that it's somewhere between 0 and 100 degrees Celsius, right? I mean, it's in there somewhere. But we don't know what the exact optimum average temperature is. With a moderate global warming, you're going to have some places that are going to be more fecund, they're going to have better climate patterns, more precipitation. Other places that will probably experience droughts. But to answer the question of whether it's bad on balance, you'd have to know all the details and variables and weigh them. And that's the sort of thing that's very, very difficult to do, especially when there are all sorts of trade-offs. Now, the reality is, I frankly think a moderate warming, and I've placed bets on this, that a moderate warming, if we could calculate it, of, say, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, on balance, over time, would be better rather than worse for the planet and the human race. Now, not 20 degrees. I don't think that's the case. But, I mean, sort of basic common sense here. Remember I told you 1,000 years ago, during the medieval warming period, Greenland didn't have as much ice on it. It was colonized. Europe was much more productive in terms of agriculture than it has been up until the present industrial techniques came to the fore. And warmth in general is better than cooling with respect to human death rates. About 10 times more people every year die from cold weather and cold snaps than from warm weather or heat waves. So that's very important. When you hear in July about how many people have died because of a heat wave, right, to figure out whether that's bad on balance has to be weighed against the number of people that are killed during cold snap or a blizzard. That's the only way to actually answer the question. You can't just say, well, if one person dies as a result of the heat wave, all warming is bad. That's not the way it works. That's not the way we think about this rationally. We have to think through the trade-offs. And the reality is, we of course know that CO2 is plant food. We all know this. Plants absorb, to put it in colloquial terms, carbon dioxide. We also know that many plants, depends on the plant, grow much more productively and more robustly when there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is a picture actually from some research by a father-son team named IDSO, who've been doing these experiments for years. And these are just basically little domes in which they can control the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere around different kinds of plants. And they vary the concentrations in CO2 and see how it changes the growth of the plants. And especially plants like bristlecone pine trees that are very sensitive to changes in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere prosper when CO2 grows. Now, why am I telling you that? The reason is because, remember I told you there are trade-offs in climate change. There's also trade-offs in the climate. When we put CO2 in the atmosphere, it's not like it just sits there forever. The climate system is in some ways like a metabolism. It has a built-in thermostat. It doesn't just go one way or the other. CO2 is released into the atmosphere. Some of it encourages the growth of plants, which sequester the CO2 and hold it in. I got, just the other day, someone sent me, someone I correspond with on email, sent me a packet of stuff from California, in which there's a big push underway to become more environmentally friendly, just like there is here in Michigan. And I noticed a little bookmark. This is my favorite thing of all the kinds of marketing techniques in the entire packet. It's just a little leaf with some fertilizer, a bunch of wildflower seeds. Put a little water on it, put it under a little bit of soil, and it grows. It grows wildflowers. Now, I don't know if this would work in Michigan this time of year or not, or this is in California. Why would you grow wildflowers? Well, they're going to sequester at least a little bit of carbon dioxide. All right? A little bit. Probably not very much, unfortunately. It'd be better to grow trees, I think. But that's the point. It's very difficult to answer the question, is it bad without knowing all the costs and all the benefits? And I would be willing to bet that moderate warming will be good on balance rather than bad. Well, here's the fourth question. And this is actually where the rubber meets the road. This is the policy question. Would the advised policies make any difference? Now let's just assume answers to the first questions. Is it warming? Let's say the answer is yes. Are we causing it? Let's say, even though I think probably not the primary cause, let's just say yes, we're causing it. Third question, is it bad? I think probably not, at least if it's just a moderate warming. But let's say it is bad, and we got to do something about it. There's still the fourth question. Would any of the advised policies, or which advised policies would actually make a difference? That's a separate question. Let's just focus on one very popular policy. I think actually 5 years from now, I'll be talking about a different policy. I think the Kyoto Protocol will go the way of the dodo bird at some point. But right now, this is sort of the most popular policy, and the United States is still badgered for not signing on to the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was a treaty agreement of nations during a UN-sponsored event in Kyoto, Japan, which called on participating nations to reduce their CO2 emissions by a set date to 5.2% less than 1990 levels. All right, so you got that in your head. We're going along, say in the United States, and we're increasing the amounts of CO2 we put in the atmosphere. Let's say we had signed it. We would be pledging that we were going to reduce our CO2 emissions to 5% below what we were emitting back in 1990. That was the idea. And many European and industrialized nations signed on. Countries like India and China were exempted because they're considered still developing countries, and then many small and very poor developing countries were exempted as well. Now that's the basic Kyoto Protocol. I don't want to get into the sort of dirty details about who did what and who was in the Senate that won a Nobel Prize for the environment that didn't sign on later. I'm not going to talk about that, all right? I want to talk about some other things. So let's assume that we had all signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, and all those European nations that aren't really succeeding were actually succeeding in the protocol. That is, we were all going to pull this off. We're all going to reduce our emissions to 5% below 1990 levels. The official estimates are that the effects of having done that would be something like a 0.07 degrees Celsius reduction in the rate of increase by 2050. All right, now that tiny reduction in the rate of increase is unmeasurable. It's so trivial. That's important. Well, these are the official estimates. Assuming the truth of the warming models, what would happen if all the participating nations signed on and succeeded in the Kyoto Protocol? A trivial reduction in the rate of increase. Right? Now that's the answer. Would it do much? It would do virtually nothing of significance. There's the other sort of difficult economic question, the question for which economists are called the dismal scientists. How much would it cost? This is the estimate for how much it would cost the worldwide economy. Somewhere between $10 and $50 trillion to abide by the rules of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, we're used to hearing billions, but trillions is still real money. That's some serious money to the worldwide economy. And so you have to ask yourself the question, look, we live in a world of limited resources in which we can't create the kingdom of God on earth. We have to make difficult choices. Why would we enact a policy which doesn't even do what it's supposed to do, we know it, that would cost the worldwide economy that much? And what other things could we buy with the money? Well, scientists and statisticians that came together in what's called the Copenhagen Consensus a few years ago actually put these questions to the test. They actually asked, let's say you had $20 billion and you could spend it on any sort of environmental or health crisis. You could spend it on AIDS in Africa, on purifying water in third world countries. You could spend it on whatever, on climate change legislation or whatever. They did a cost-benefit analysis of these things. Climate change ended up at the bottom in the expenditure. And as a result of their sort of analyses, they determined that at least to supply worldwide sanitation technology to the rest of the world that doesn't have it, it would cost about $200 billion. Now, that doesn't deal with maintaining the technology, it's supplying it in the first place, all right? Still a lot of money. But $200 billion to supply the rest of the world with sanitized water compared to $10 to $50 trillion to do nothing. And that's what we're talking about. That's what everybody's talking about. A policy that would do practically nothing. This is what leads me to suspect that there's some strange things afoot in this debate. That very intelligent people would continue to advocate this. Remember, I'm not giving you, by the way, that was not the ExxonMobil statistic. on the cost of the Kyoto Protocol. That's the official number, all right? By the way, none of the data I'm giving here come from suspect websites or organizations. There's all sorts of standard stuff. In fact, there's nothing you can't find in a Google search in about 5 minutes that I'm talking about here. All right, so those are the questions. I haven't sort of supplied any really good answers, obviously. I, if anything, wanted to sort of provoke you to think more clearly about this issue. But I do want to answer this question directly because it's often what I'm asked. How can you doubt a consensus? Look, if it's true that all the sort of really knowledgeable people with the technical knowledge to answer this question agree on the answers to the question, how can you question it? Now, as I told you, there's not actually a consensus on that second question of whether humans are the major contributor. There's still wide debate in the relevant scientific disciplines on that issue. But let's assume there was. Let's assume that all the really smart people with the relevant scientific credentials more or less agreed on the issue. Would there ever be a time in which an ordinary person without the relevant credentials could rationally doubt the consensus? Ask yourself that question. Is there ever a time in which you could rationally doubt a consensus? And what would it be? The reason I ask this question is because if you look at human history, especially recent human history, at any moment there is an intellectual orthodoxy. Intellectual orthodoxy is that thing that is strongly enforced in belief so that the most prestigious people will believe it. They won't believe it because the evidence is in favor of it. They won't believe it because they know anything about it. They'll believe it because it's the prestigious thing to believe in, and there's social consequences to disbelieving it. It's really easy to recognize the last intellectual orthodoxy. Eugenics in the 1920s. All the really smart people in the 1920s, not the Nazis, this is the 20s, the United States, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, all the major universities believed in eugenics. They believed in the scientific principle that we needed to be purging the human race of the unfit. Now, most of them believe we should be doing this voluntarily by, say, sterilizing the unfit so that they don't reproduce. We find that repugnant because we associate it with Nazism. But that was the intellectual orthodoxy in the 1920s in this country. And we recognize it now. The question is, how do you recognize the intellectual orthodoxy when you're in the middle of it? When all the social pressures are in favor of believing it? That's the difficult question. And if you can find the answers to that question, you'll have the answers for how you can doubt the consensus. Now, the problem is that the modern world, unlike the medieval world in which the views, say, of priests or clerics were held to be perhaps, if not really beyond reproach, in some social sense beyond reproach, it's scientific views that in the modern world that tend to be held as beyond reproach because scientific knowledge is privileged. We think, well, people have their sort of private opinions about morality and aesthetics and art and all that kind of subjective stuff. The really rational stuff, the stuff we know, is in science. And so if something has a scientific patina, we tend to think it should be believed. But remember, every intellectual orthodoxy in this era is given, at least officially, the patina of science. And so that's not going to answer the question. That was the claim of Marxism, that it was a truly scientific social science that explained the progress of the history of human races and societies. Well, here's my answer to how you can doubt a consensus. Not especially profound. But when you have good reasons to doubt what you've been told. All right? Now, what are the good reasons? Well, this is just purely my opinion. But I think one of the ways in which you can detect that an intellectual orthodoxy is afoot currently is when you look at how the debate itself proceeds. When the debate is about the evidence and the arguments, then whatever side you're on, you can think, well, at least there's a robust debate taking place. But when skeptics who have very little to gain by being skeptics or being in the minority are suddenly attacked personally, and almost always attacked personally rather than addressed in terms of the debate, I think that's strong evidence that there's intellectual orthodoxy afoot. Here's how the great climate scientist Ellen Goodman put it in the Boston Globe last year. Sorry, that was a little sarcastic. Here's how she put it. Now, I read Goodman's column as a kind of representative sample of Boston frequently. And I can't tell that she knows anything at all about this issue. And here's how she put it. And she felt free to publish this. She said, I would like to say that we're at a point where global warming is impossible to deny. Let's just say that global warming deniers are now on a par with Holocaust deniers. Now, in logic, they call this the argumentum ad Hitlerum. All right, not really. But when someone's argument is compared to Hitler or to Holocaust deniers, all right, when the argument can very perfectly well be refuted on the evidence, you know that somebody's not playing fairly. And when a well-known and respected columnist for the Boston Globe feels free to say this, you know that it's almost impossible at that point to have a rational discussion. Now, this is despite the fact that a past president of the National Academy of Sciences, all right, Frederick Seitz, who died recently, doubted the so-called global warming consensus. That is, that we are experiencing catastrophic human-induced climate change. Or that a very prestigious MIT scientist named Richard Lenson doubts it. Or that thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists with relevant credentials doubt some aspect of the official claim. Nevertheless, they can be called Holocaust deniers with impunity. This, to me, is evidence that this is the intellectual orthodoxy of our day, and that it bears special scrutiny for that purpose. This is the second reason, I think, that even if there were a consensus on the basic claim, we'd have some reason to doubt it. It's this. Predictions of environmental disaster or global environmental disaster are almost always wrong. I would almost be willing to say always wrong. I'd say almost, just kind of a little weasel word there to protect myself, right? It started in the 1850s with a man named Thomas Malthus, a British demographer, who did some basic mathematical calculations, basically multiplication, and he discovered there was a point in the near future in which the human population growth, which was going up exponentially, was going to outstrip the production food production. Get it? So here's the curve in human population. Here's food production. And when population outstripped food production, there'd be worldwide starvation and famine. That didn't happen. Malthus later in life realized his mistake. But there's always been at least a few Malthus wannabes in every generation up to the present that have made the same basic argument. The famous Paul Ehrlich in his book, The Population Bomb, which continues to be revised. He revises the date forward as to when the impending disaster is going to come. He reminds me of Christian prophecy scholars who insist on giving a date for Jesus' return, right? The trick is you want to put the date far enough out that you're not falsified, right? This is the problem. The same thing happens with environmental disasters. The claims, when they're verifiable, they're near enough in the future, they're always wrong. And if they're far enough out in the future, then they're unfalsifiable. And so I think this, again, is a reason to doubt the basic claim. And finally, I think we should look at how this specific claim has occurred just in the last 100 years. I have a colleague, Holly Raleigh, who brought me in the other morning. She was going through some materials that her mother had kept. And this is from the Muskegon Chronicle. Does the Muskegon Chronicle still exist? Okay. I recently moved here just 2.5 years ago. Sorry. It's the Muskegon Chronicle from 1971. Grandfather's Big Snows, mere flurries today. If you read the article, it's about the cold ice age that's impending. Right? If you remember, 1975 cover story in Newsweek was about an ensuing ice age on which there was essentially no scientific disagreement. It was a claim in 1975. Now, we were in a cooling trend in the 70s. And the claim of catastrophic global warming began almost as soon as the warming trend began. This is from Chuck Assay, comic strip in the Colorado Springs Gazette, 1895, the New York Times. A geologist predicted the world may yet be frozen again. 1932, the Earth's heating up, the New York Times. 1975, Time in the New York Times. A major cooling is widely considered inevitable. That's a quote. April 3, 2006, Time magazine. The climate is changing and global warming is to blame. Just in the lifetimes of many in this room, there have been 3 shifts. And notice that the media has always been a leading indicator. This story does not sell a lot of newspapers. Not much is happening with the climate. Right? You just never see that headline. It's boring. So the media in general, where we get most of our information on this, is always going to encourage, just by its nature, some kind of catastrophe. And finally, I think is actually the most important point, perhaps, is that we need to keep our sanity. Most of us in the United States actually are unaware of all of the environmental progress that's been made in the West in the last 100 years. For much of human history, most people died of various kind of environmental illnesses. Poison water, poison food, malaria, airborne illness, things like that. How many of us know people that have died of malaria? Now, if you have some missionary friends, you might know someone. How many of us know people that have died from poison water? Millions of people die from that still. And yet it's been completely eradicated in the industrialized world. We take that for granted. It's sort of the background. And now we're concerned about the output of carbon dioxide, which is part of the life cycle. It's important to realize the context and the progress we've made. I was delighted to see this actually in the New Yorker a couple of years ago. You got these cavemen speaking. He said, I think you can read it, but one is sitting there, something that's just not right. Now, they use good grammar, which seems strange to me, but our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. What's going on here? Well, it's surely one of the main indicators of general health, right, at least the general health of the human race, is life expectancy. And human life expectancy has been going up in the last century. Right? Now, it doesn't mean there's nothing still to be done. It doesn't mean we're not messing things up. But I think we have to keep a clear head and keep perspective on this question, especially when we're dealing with an issue like global warming. Because the truth of the matter is there are basic environmental stewardship issues that every one of us has to deal with every day that we can actually do something about. It's just quite possible that we'll spend so much of our time focused on the issue of global warming, a global issue, that even if it were happening and we were causing it, it's unclear of what exactly we would do or could realistically do to change it. That we'll focus less of our attention on those things that we could actually do something about. And that, I think, finally is where we ought to focus our attention as stewards of the environment. If we want to apply the theological principle, we need to apply it prudentially. And to apply it prudentially, we have to apply it in some way that we can affect, something that we can specifically do. I won't answer all those questions, but I hope at the very least that I encourage you to think more clearly about this issue. And with that, we'll end and take questions. Thank you. I think what we're going to do is these guys are going to take the mics, and if you just stay in your seat and raise your hand, they will bring the mic to you. And I've been asked to say, if you'd please just try to actually ask a question. So put it in the interrogative, and just ask one question so we can get as many as we can in the limited time. So feel free to raise your hand. Oh, okay. Sure, go ahead. I don't know that the mic's on. We're already here. Already here? Okay, let's do this one first then.
Do you have any idea why the proponents of this theory of catastrophic human-caused global climate change believe that? I don't mean the people like us who read the popular media, the newspapers, right. Time magazine. I mean the people who came up with this idea and then they are really pushing it. You know, the Al Gores of the world. Why are they pushing this so hard? Why do they believe this so strongly?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not of the view that there's a lot of people that are pushing it just because they have a financial interest in it. I don't think that's true on either side. I think almost everyone that's sort of debating this issue actually thinks that they're right, that their view is accurate. I think Al Gore believes it. Now, you know, people say, well, Al Gore's making a lot of money on these, sort of carbon credit schemes that he's doing. That's true, but I don't think it's why he believes it. And so frankly, I think it's a combination of reasons. I think some scientists that deal with a narrow specialty that may see a confirmation of the theory simply believe it because they think that their field confirms it. The nature of natural science, though, is that it's highly specialized. And so a person that's in paleoclimatology, which is a study of old, past climate, that person doesn't know a lot about human biology. They're specialists. And so you can find some sort of confirmation in a narrow field, but it doesn't mean that the preponderance of the evidence goes in that way. I do think, though, that at this point there is a strong, strong incentive to believe the official story. And I say that the official story is not the views of the scientists if you polled them. It's the official story that you'd hear from Newsweek. And the truth of the matter is there's almost nothing whatsoever to gain if you're a scientist that does research, say, on the Antarctic continent. Right? With the Antarctic Peninsula, 2% of the continent that's sticking out is warming. But if you're doing research on the rest of the continent, it turns out it's either staying the same or getting cooler. Right? Well, that's, it's very unlikely that you can get funding for research to do that. And so you can, Google this, and a lot of scientists talk about how they can take very mundane research on, some obscure invertebrate and put a global warming spin into the research. It makes it much easier to get federal grants. There's about $2 billion in research monies available on this subject right now. Trust me, ExxonMobil is not funding anything like that on the other side. There's, maybe a few $1 million available from various nonprofits to ask contrary questions, but the incentive is strong. Now, a lot of that has to do with sort of satellite research. It's actually really expensive, and so I'm not saying scientists want funding so they make things up. I'm just saying that sort of social pressures are in that way, in that direction at the moment. I do also think that there is a tendency, for various reasons, to believe these sort of catastrophic scenarios. I mean, I think there's weird sort of sociological reasons. I don't know why that is. The truth of the matter is, remember Y2K, right? Okay, looking back, I'm proud to say I was a published Y2K skeptic. I sweated some bullets. I had some friends that thought I was crazy, right? But everyone seemed to believe it. Now, when a third of the cell phones go dead in the United States, right, because of some weird satellite glitch, we don't have mass chaos in Lord of the Flies, right? But we all thought some little glitch was going to cause world catastrophe. We have a tendency to believe these things. I think it's dangerous. But I don't think you can sort of reduce it to conspiracies at the UN or to just mere financial incentives. I think that the answer is many and varied, quite frankly.
In one of your charts, you showed us that over some period of time, the amount of CO2 is going up about 20%, I figure.
Right from, is it the chart from 1955 to the present?
Okay.
Right.
In the same time frame, has there been any change, and how much, if there has, in the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere?
The water vapor, of course, is an interesting point. I don't have a chart on that. As I said, there are greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane. The most important and significant greenhouse gas is water vapor. It makes up is a vast, there's a debate, but I think it's something like 95% of the greenhouse effect is due to water vapor. And I don't know what the sort of variation of that over time is, quite frankly. This is just CO2. This is taken from Mauna Loa, an observatory in Hawaii, that's taken to be fairly reliable. Now, that's an important point, because people hear that and say, wait a sec, why aren't we talking about water vapor then? The reason is because CO2 in the models is assumed to be an amplifier, so that it creates a sort of amplifying effect, so that you need just a little of it to do a lot of damage. That's the theoretical assumption, though. So although we're dealing in just sort of small trace amounts, you can just put small trace amounts of testosterone in your system. It does a lot, right? That's the idea with CO2. The question is it a positive feedback that amplifies, or is it counterbalanced by other negative feedback processes? Let me give you an example. In August of 2007, a scientist at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, named Roy Spencer, published a paper in Geophysical Letters establishing, I think, a negative feedback having to do with cloud cover, essentially a natural thermostat that counterbalances the effects of the greenhouse effect that were not taken into account in the most recent IPCC report of the UN. In fact, that same system that Spencer showed as a negative feedback is treated as a positive feedback in the UN report. In other words, it's treated as if it's going to make things worse rather than better. To really answer this question, climate is exquisitely complicated. We understand a drop of it at the moment. We have to know all of the positive and negative feedbacks in the system and figure out how they balance themselves out. My suspicion is the fact that the Earth has been habitable for hundreds of millions of years, and the output of the sun has varied dramatically over that time period, suggests that the Earth climate system is a lot more adaptable and changeable than we give it credit for, and that it is able to account and accommodate these slight changes. That's my basic view. Up here? Okay. I can't, by the way, see very well, so just sort of wave at the mic guys. So we'll take this one.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a comment. I would encourage the audience to look at an article by Dr. Tom Ackerman. He's at the University of Washington, a climatologist there. He came to Calvin College to present in the January series in January of 2005. He published an article in 2007 entitled Christian Responses to Global Warming. It's published in Perspectives in Science and Christian Belief. You can Google the article and pull it off of his webpage, and I encourage anyone who's interested to look into it. Thank you.
Great. There's also there's several really good websites, and one is called I think it's climatechangedaily.com, and it publishes daily sort of views on multiple sides, side by side, on this issue, so you can sort of see a running tally of the debate. There's a textbook by Sir John Houghton, who's also a Christian, that disagree with me on some of these subjects on global warming. That he was at one time, I think, the chairman of the IPCC at UN. So for other perspectives. Some more questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Fabulous job, by the way. I do have I think you've been a little too generous or gracious in putting to the side not just the financial motivation, but political ideology,
right?
Distribution of wealth on a global setting, what you can't do through politics, failed Marxist and socialist ideologies.
Right.
If you're an anti-capitalist, you also are going to find. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I have my own sort of private theories on this, and the longer I've sort of studied this issue, the more, frankly, the more cynical I've become about it. I'm surprised at some of the things. I'm surprised, for instance, that Al Gore won the Nobel Prize when he made a simple scientific error that even the New York Times had to correct, that anyone can find out in 5 minutes. It tells me that there's an intellectual orthodoxy at play, that would happen, that sort of blinds us. The reason I think most interested, or should be most interested in this issue, and that all of you should be, is that ultimately how this is decided politically, it's decided in the wrong way, it's going to increase the price of energy worldwide. That's not going to make any difference to me. If my gasoline, frankly, I drive back and forth, Grand Rapids to downtown every day. It's practically all I do. My car, it could double, and it's not going to change my lifestyle. Those people that are at the bottom rung of the economic ladder, by definition, the vast majority of their costs are things like energy. So a change or an increase in the cost of energy is going to affect them detrimentally. That's the problem, because energy is how we live. Without energy, we don't live. And so those of us, frankly, in the first world, unless energy costs just multiply, it's not going to make that much difference. It's going to make a difference in the long run if we do weird things with world markets and energy for misguided reasons for those at the bottom rung of the economic ladder. That's why, frankly, I think this is a morally significant issue. So, have to have more questions than that.
Excuse me. Speaking of human biology, wouldn't CO2 gases have a devastating impact on human beings? I mean, aren't we more frail than the land, than nature? Is that a valid argument?
I'm not positive I know what the argument is. Can you just try to rephrase it? I'm just not sure. I could end up answering some completely different question.
Well, we have flourished. We're healthy.
Right.
We are surviving and doing quite well. They say that the Earth is warming. Wouldn't global warming have an effect on us
Sure.
physically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at some point, right? That's why I asked the question about is the warming bad? Of course, if the average global temperature is 800 degrees Fahrenheit, we're dead, right? And if it's 0, we're probably dead, at least for maybe a few of us on the equator. And so the question really, ultimately, I mean, it's weird because we talk about saving the Earth. The Earth's going to be here in any case, right? Just like Venus is there. The question is whether we're going to make the Earth more or less habitable for human beings and for other forms of life. So-called simple forms of life, like bacteria, there are going to be some extremophiles in the bottom of the ocean almost no matter what we do. So what we're really concerned about is the sort of health of the biosphere, the surface of the planet, where we exist and where we and other animals exist. We are the most sensitive. Metazoans, large multicellular animals, are the most sensitive to variations. Simple life is not. Simple life can exist in much more adverse conditions. So the question is, what's the range? Obviously, with modern technology, the range is much wider than it was in the past. That's why there's people living in Florida now and people living in Michigan because of modern technology. And so, in general, I would put it this way. The more advanced the society is, the more adaptable it is to a wider range of climate variations. And the truth of the matter is, I don't think we can do a whole lot about global climate change. It's going to happen no matter what we do to some degree. And so what we ought to be concerned about, is helping those parts of the world that are not as wealthy as we are, and therefore not as adaptable as we are, become wealthier, so that they can adapt to whatever climate change actually takes place in the next 50 or 100 years.
I have a question.
Can somebody wait?
Over here?
Oh, thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry.
I read something that worried me more than the global warming story recently, that there's a new concept of geoengineering, and that on a large scale people may try to tamper with the global warming by emitting like dust particles in the upper atmosphere.
Right.
And they were even talking about different countries using it to have a balance that would be favorable to their climate, like to cool their or heat if they wanted to be hotter.
Right.
And I thought, well, how can a person like me stop anyone who just, some country or some crazy who decided to do that? So I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, sure. Notice that's a possible response. Let's assume that there is human-induced catastrophic global warming occurring, and it's because of the increase in a specific greenhouse gas, CO2. One response would be to release certain types of particulate matter into the air that reflects sunlight back out into space or something like that. Right? That does seem kind of creepy. I don't think there's anything strange about that in principle. If we were really certain that we were causing the warming, we knew why we were causing it, how we were causing it, and it was going to be catastrophic, and we knew with some degree of certainty the effects of the stuff we're putting in the atmosphere to counterbalance it. Problem is I think it's an amazing amount of hubris to think we know either side of that equation well enough to know what to do. I certainly wouldn't be in favor of it. Unfortunately, it seems unlikely to me that any governments are going to spend billions of dollars dumping potentially toxic pollutants in the air just to shave a few tenths of a degree off the global warming. But yeah, this is the kind of speculative sort of scenarios that we're going to hear a lot about, at least as long as we assume we're causing the warming and it's catastrophic. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to have a question on the causation and the comment about the correlation isn't causation. I do agree with you there that the correlation isn't the same as causation. Nevertheless, a good part of our medical treatments is based upon essentially correlative studies. A key example is that of smoking and lung cancer.
Right.
Do I take your comments, the negative comments about using that as a basis for making decisions, that you don't see the connection between smoking and lung cancer?
No. I said correlation doesn't prove causation, but if there is causation, there's going to be correlation, obviously, and the stronger a correlation, especially if you have a theoretical explanation for it, or if you have ancillary evidence that suggests it. That's how you reinforce a hypothesis. This is just, sort of basic good scientific reasoning. Notice what I said. I didn't say correlation isn't the same as causation, therefore let's be done with it. I said correlation is not the same as causation. We know from past climate records that the causation, if it exists, is in the other direction, because the temperature goes up before the CO2 goes up. And 3, we know of other plausible causes for it, like variations in the output of the sun. It's all 3 of those. So I'm not saying just because we can't establish causation, therefore we should be skeptical. It's all 3 of those things that I think should cause us to be hesitant in being certain on this point. The other point is this. We often forget this. Everything we're talking about here is predictions of what is going to happen 50 or 100 years into the future. It is based on extremely complicated, highly theoretical computer models, which we know a few of the variables, and we don't know any of the others. You tweak the variables, you completely change the outcome. Right? Highly speculative computer models that give you these Bayesian probability outcomes. All right? By definition, that kind of intellectual enterprise is going to be tentative. It's predictions of the future based on evidence we only know in part. And so to claim certainty for something like that, in principle, I think is suspicious. We're not talking about, sort of basic studies done over and over on things like, say, smoking and lung cancer. Great question.
I think that was the last question.
Okay. Thank you
Thanks,
for your
Jay.
attention, and we'll be here for an hour or something like that. All right.